Mrs. Hanson here, and as you know, we have been looking at cells as systems. Today, you are on day 6, in which we're going to be comparing animal and plant cells and looking at their structures and what makes them look different. We know that both animals and plants are living things, and so they need some similar things. However, when we look at the microscopic level, at the cell of these organisms, we can see that there are some differences. And as we know in science, there's always a purpose behind those differences. So that's what we're going to dive into today. You had the opportunity already to think about why might plant and animal cells have different structures. What might be the reasoning behind that? And so I asked you to think about what organelle each type of cell has and what those organelles might be designed to do. So today we're going to dive into that a little more. And I want you to make sure, if you happen to have a piece of paper handy, you might want to take some notes as I'm sharing this information, just because afterwards you'll click on to the next slide, and then in that slide you'll be asked to record some things that you learned about animal cells versus plant cells. So if you have a piece of paper handy, it might be helpful to jot things down as you go, but you can always refer back to this video as we move on. So let's start out with the amazing world of living things and zoom into animals in particular. You have here on your screen 3 amazingly different animals. They have different ways of getting food. They have different sizes. They have different coloring. They have different environments that they might live in. And if we think about all the different animals on the world, you might think of animals that live underwater, animals that live in the Arctic, animals that live in a desert versus animals that live in a rainforest. And there are such diverse animals out there, and yet they all need certain things to survive. So let's think about that. What do animals need to survive? Well, it all boils down to energy. They need energy and they need food. And that energy comes from their food. And that's really, if an animal doesn't have food, it's not going to survive anymore. To get the food or to process the food, animals have organs and they have systems that help them process this. So we know they have mouths, they have teeth, they have stomach, they have claws, they might have legs, fins, wings, any of the body systems that we have that help an organism to eat food. If those go down, so do the animal. So it's necessary for animals to have energy. They get that energy from the food that they eat. And they have to go get their food. They have to hunt their food. So to hunt their food, they might need be able to fly. They might need to be able to climb, run, walk, dig, all different types of things that an animal has to do to be able to go get its food so that it can survive, because it needs that energy. And if it doesn't have energy, it doesn't survive. Now, plants are different than animals in that they don't need to go somewhere to get their food. They don't need these things. They don't need to be able to do these things, I should say. So they don't need as much energy. However, we have big animals out there. You saw that elephant, one of the biggest terrestrial land animals. It has, it's so humongous that it needs a ton of food to be able to survive. And if you think about smaller animals like a chipmunk or a squirrel or a mouse, they need less food, and that makes sense. The small animals run through their food really quickly, so they need to eat very often. But the big animals, they might not. So they can have a large meal and then go a few days, and then they need to replenish. But they need to be able to go get that food, so they need to have the energy to be able to do that. Now, when we look at plants, you can see this is a gorgeous scenery of a rainforest. All that green pops out. You can see there's plants of different sizes. You can see plants that have large, huge leaves and plants that might have smaller leaves, all the way down to the moss or the algae that might be growing in the water. So let's think about, what do plants need to be able to survive? Well, it's the same thing. Plants need food. Now, they don't eat food the way you think of a human or an animal eating food. They need food, and they get that from the sun. A plant absorbs sunlight. So in the absence of sunlight, a plant can't be successful. It can't grow the way it needs to. And we know that to get its food, to get its sunlight, to collect its sunlight, plants have different structures. So a tree has a big tall trunk to soak that water up, and it takes that water and it interacts with the sunlight that it collects, and it turns it to energy. And they have stems, they have leaves, they have flowers, and everything about the design of the plant is to, number one, be able to take that food or take that sunlight and turn it into energy so that the plant can continue to survive. Now, plants are unlike animals in that they do not move. They grow where they are, where they bloom. They grow in that one spot. So they don't need as much energy as animals do. But because they grow in that one spot, they need to have a really strong structure because they need to be able to stay there, and they need to be able to survive windstorms and rain and maybe, animals passing by. And so you'll notice that the structure of a plant cell is different than in animals because it has a really hard exterior. It has a cell wall, and that cell wall helps to build structure so that the plant can continue to survive. It can stay steady, and it can deal with anything that might come its way. Whereas animal cells are more rounded and they're actually more flexible because an animal needs to be able to move, to be able to go get its food, to be able to get its energy, to be able to survive. So animal cells are much more like, if you think about compression, let's say if you've ever seen a Rocky movie or a boxing movie where someone gets punched in the face and you see that slow-mo of the face kind of like stretching out. The body needs to be able to respond so that it can bounce back, so that it can get back to doing what it needed to do, to be able to get energy, to be able to process that food, to be able to survive. Now, just like animals, plants need more energy if they are larger plants. And so they have larger leaves. They might have palms. They might have really large leaves. And they need to absorb more sunlight. So that's why they have such big leaves. Smaller plants need less energy, so they might have smaller leaves, smaller stems, smaller flowers, because they don't need as much energy to survive. So that's why we have this vast difference in the types of plants and animals that you might see on Earth. Now, to kind of boil this down for you, and again, if you're taking notes, this might be helpful. If we're looking at animal cells versus plant cells, or animals versus plants, an animal has to control how much food that they get, and it all depends on their size, and it all depends on their needs. So animals have different diets. Some might eat grass, some might be carnivores, some might be omnivores. So they have different needs to have their body process their food. It's less likely to see a tiny little animal being a carnivore because they don't need as much energy, whereas a large animal like a lion is a carnivore because it needs the proteins and the fat from the other animals' bodies to be able to produce energy. The types of food that animals eat and the amount that they eat is directly correlated to how much energy they need. When it comes to plants don't need to control how much energy they get. They don't need to be able to travel because they can always get food from the sunlight. So every time there's sunshine, the plants are being fed. Now there has to be water and there has to be soil and there has to be good growing conditions. But as long as there's sunlight and soil and water, a plant can be successful. They're always getting food that they need when there's sunlight, and they don't absorb sunlight at night, so that's when they do a lot of the processing of their food. When it comes to animals, let's go back one slide. When it comes to animals, the energy is produced in the cell through the mitochondria. So you're going to learn a lot about mitochondria because this structure is what processes energy and turns that energy into, or the energy from the food into sugars that the body can use to then be able to do the things that it needs to do to be able to survive. And we call that process cellular respiration. So that's the process of mitochondria transferring food or taking in that food, processing that food, and putting it back out as sugars in the body that the body can use. When it comes to plants have something special called chloroplasts. Their chloroplasts are unique. And their chloroplasts are what make them green. So when we were looking at that image before of all those plants and all that greenery, The similarity is that greenness, and the greenness is because they have chloroplasts. The more chloroplast a cell has, the more energy it can take in. So this is the structure that processes the energy from the sunlight, and that it turns it into sugars that plant can then use to be able to survive and be successful, to get more water, to get more sugar, or to get more sunlight that it can process into more energy. And so that process is called photosynthesis. So our animals use mitochondria, or animal cells, I should say, use mitochondria to process their food. And our plants use chloroplasts to process the sunlight and turn it into energy for those cells. So after this, I want you to make sure that you click forward onto the last slide for today, and you're going to be using what you learned today to complete the slide. And you can see it's just asking you to complete the chart for animal cells with at least 4 bullet points, and the same thing for plant cells. Feel free to rewind, feel free to rewatch, feel free to do your own research, but I'm looking for why might that structure of the cells be different? What are the reasons behind that? Keep up the great work, and we'll talk soon.